Still, without a shred of truth or evidence to the contrary, the statesman has engaged in this witch hunt.
All right, let me see if I get this right, Jim. He's caught in a sting. He is charged with this behavior. He admits to this behavior.
To a courtroom.
Yes. Then he says, I didn't mean to admit it, and it's a newspaper's fault.
And the story is broken by roll call. And then the Idaho
roll call, which
newspaper,
is a
Capitol Hill newspaper,
Washington, yeah.
And then the Idaho Statesman, which has been researching the story, interviewed 300 people, including a zillion of his fraternity brothers from 40 years ago, and sat on the story because they didn't think they had enough stuff, even though they did have some pretty good stuff, then runs it. And so Craig, realizing that he's got a lot better chance of getting some traction in Idaho, running against a local Idaho paper than some paper back in D.C., tries to do this campaign. I think that will be remembered as like the worst conceived press conference, beginning with this opening phrase of "Thank you all for coming out." And that's the way not to do it.
That's right.
And then
aspiring politicians,
and then not having the sense to end with "I'm sorry you all came out." Right. Neal, am I right? Did he perform amazing leaps here?
Oh, well, he was awful, and he did perform amazing leaps, and essentially he lied. He said he didn't consult counsel. Now it looks as if he did consult counsel. But let me take exception to something that Jim says, because I think there was one thing on which Craig was right. He was the subject of a witch hunt that was launched by the Idaho Statesman based on an anonymous, uncorroborated charge that ran in a blog. Now, it turned out that he revealed himself to be a witch in this witch hunt, but that doesn't absolve the Idaho Statesman of responsibility.
But wasn't the Idaho Statesman just researching? In other words, is it a witch hunt if you keep your research to yourself?
But I'll ask you this, Eric. What was the significance of, or the public interest in, what the Idaho Statesman was doing in trying to out him, which is essentially what they were trying to do?
The difference, Neal, between his public statements about homosexuality and his private behavior, don't you think, Jane, that if any politician, forget the issue, has a gulf between what he says publicly on an issue and how he behaves privately, that's news?
I think so, although I think the media also use that to look into the sex lives of politicians.
Yes, exactly.
So, you know, I think they behaved responsibly, not running with it, and I do think the fact that he was against, you know, same-sex unions, he's against discrimination, he's not for, but he wasn't for a measure about discrimination against gays and no gays in the military. When someone takes that stance and they're leading what appears to be a double life, I think it is worthy of looking at. What is really the most damning thing was this tape that was played, and that to me is the thing that really ultimately did him in.
Cal, Jane says it's worth looking at. Is it worth reporting in detail and making a national issue of?
Well, I think it is for a number of reasons. Number one, the Republican Party has styled itself as the party of family values. Now, if you're out there speaking one thing and voting a certain way, and you're doing something else in your private life, I think that's a legitimate story. But
it's not a rap on an entire party.
No, of course it's not any more than it's a rap on all of the Democratic Party when you've got heterosexual Democrats out there hitting on women while standing for women's rights. I think Tom DeLay was right up to a point when he appeared on the Today Show and said that the media have a double standard on this. I think they are more willing to forgive Democrats. They bought the private sex life of Bill Clinton almost fully, even while still reporting it, but they apply a different standard to Republicans and allege corruption and actual corruption.
Well, what I was saying is there was no hard evidence until June 8th, so everything else was speculation. But let's talk about double standard.
But that's what I'm saying.
Let's talk about a double standard here.
Which hunt?
Hold on, here it comes.
The Bush badge.
Who's running this?
Are you waiting? Are you waiting for the double standard?
Here comes the big blow.
David Vitter, who engaged in illegal activity, which he confessed to publicly, that is a solicitation of a prostitute, got off essentially scot-free, not only from the Republican Party, where he was actually cheered by the Republican Party Republican breakfast, but he got off pretty much scot-free by the media, while Craig is being hammered. Now, why is this? Well, we know there's a homophobia in the Republican Party. That's accepted. But I'm suggesting that there may actually be some latent homophobia in the media, in the mainstream media. And that's why Craig is getting a harder examination than Vitter did, Vitter hasn't been examined by the Senate Ethics Committee. Vitter hasn't been pulled from his committee assignments. Vitter hasn't been touched.
I think Neal is actually right about the latent homophobia, even in the mainstream media, even the liberal media. They're just not that keen on people in bathrooms molesting their children, potentially. But I think on Vitter, it is worth noting, he did confess. And Craig confessed by contrast only to the police and then denied it. I mean, look, Vitter is a scurvy character who really, if he had real honor, would resign. But he did confess he was forgiven by his wife, and he was never convicted in a court of law, which is interesting. And it makes you go back and do it, but they haven't yet.
And that's the difference.
Right.